Good afternoon, Cape Fear. We are doing Afterthoughts, and this is where we sit and kind of reflect a little bit on the sermon. Today's was a unique one because we have somebody in the church who, I mean, pretty humorous guy, but he made the recommendation that since we are reading through 7 Psalms in a week, that I should play a game of Russian roulette and let them pick a psalm for me to preach on Sunday. I said absolutely not. There's no way in the world I would do that to myself. But Thomas said, I'll prepare 7 sermons. And so he did. And so today we did Psalm 74. And I mean, overall, good job. And I enjoy it. I think the kind of where my head started going is I'm dealing with so many people right now who are going through so much life, so many problems, so many issues. And I know regularly I talk about the idea that we're not promised this good life uh, that some people think that that's what the Christian life is about. But it's really the ability to be with God, to depend on Him, to give it to Him, and that's really what I like about Psalm 74, especially when we start looking at basically they're saying, I mean, kind of early on, your foes have roared in the midst of your meeting place, and it's talking about chopping trees and just basically destroying everything and profaning everything in God's name. And yet they know there's never a time when this is going on that they doubt if God exists. Because what my favorite line in this entire psalm is verse 11. It says, "Why do you hold back your hand, your right hand? Take it from the fold of your garment and destroy them." It's they understand his sovereignty. They understand his power and his ability, and even when they're going through all of it, they know that if it is in his will, that he will do what he needs to do.
Mhm.
And so you talked about some instances in your life when you were, struggling through some hard times, and we all, we've all been there. But you have a particular one that you did talk about, and you went through an entire, I'll use Christian words, you went through an entire season of this where it felt like, I don't know if it felt like he was abandoning you or whatnot, but um, as a pastor of a church, you went through a very difficult time, and yet you're still in the ministry.
Mhm.
And what you went through would have sent many of us running for the absolute hills and saying, no, ministry is not for me, but yet you persevered. Is this the reason? Like, how did you make it through? Did you reflect on these Psalms consistently? How did you not have, how did you not abandon ship?
During that time, it was actually First Peter that I was reading through, and I think I read the entirety of First Peter every day, several days in a row. And it was the first reading of Peter and suffering for righteousness' sake. That these guys have not done anything to warrant this persecution and what they were facing. So that resonates. And there were even times when I was reading where Jesus, he's healing people and telling the truth, and he is just getting slammed.
Right.
And so those gospel stories became alive for me in a way that I felt them, like I understood, no longer in theory. There's a sense of practice. And so I took comfort from that. But there's also this element of, before I began learning the language of virtue, learning perseverance. There's only one way, and I did think back to a previous church where that season lasted for less than a year.
Mhm.
It was very difficult, and it was a lot of similarities to what I was going through, but it was a much shorter time. And I said, and sort of realized, even before that, before we ever came to Fayetteville, I had gone through some things, but again, much shorter. So I was almost like recounting, looking, and like God had been preparing me for this. And I think what is difficult, because when you're in the middle of it, you don't know how long it's going to last.
Right.
Like, am I supposed to do this for the next 10 years? I don't, I couldn't even think about that because like your soul just gets crushed. So I said, all right, I'm going to take it 1 week at a time, just go from Sunday to Sunday kind of thing. And during that time, prayer, I was praying through a variety of like there were different books that I was using. One of those was like the Handbook of Prayer, and I've mentioned that in some different places. Ken Boa has this handbook to prayer that just utilizes scripture
Yeah.
and praying those things regularly. Like it just brought me comfort. And that's really kind of what it was comfort and practical things. Because again, I didn't know where this was going to end. I didn't know. I even joke to this day. I was always say, that I'm here until God calls me away or He calls me home, and I was always away, always add, or unless they kill me. And most people kind of laugh, and I was like, there was concern.
Well, that's
There
also him
was
calling you home, right?
well, yeah, that would be part of the calling home.
Yeah.
But I have it was during that time too. I have pastor friends who were going through that, whose physical well being was literally threatened. We have stories in this area
Well,
of
let's be clear.
yeah,
During that time when I was not really wanting to be a pastor, nor did I think this was going to be a part of my life, you handed me the book, The Devil in Pew Number 7, to, I don't know, scare me, and it worked. I didn't want to be a pastor after that either,
well, it
but I
was
think I was
fascinating.
prepared.
Yeah, it was because I was handed that and told that people in the church were related to the murderer, and this is what happens. Like these are the kinds of things that go on even in ministry. And so, I think it's one thing when you're dealing with the pagan world and you're getting mistreatment or things are happening, but I think there was that element for me why like I don't know of a worse way like when it's happening inside the church.
Mm-hmm.
And I think this is why in reading the Psalms to hear this different ways, we need to hear this. We need to, in the midst of those trials, be reminded regularly because that's kind of how I was. That I would go to a conference or I would do something and I would just remember the goodness of God and I would feel, okay, I've sort of rallied myself together and then I have to go back and face it all again. And but it wasn't from a resignation standpoint. It was just this is what is required. This
Right.
is what I must do. And I think, maybe if I'd planned the sermon a little bit better, but I think looking back now, like when we walked away and, I asked my wife the question, did I ever dishonor myself? Did I ever, behave wrongly, whatever? And she's crying and she's like, I almost wish you had, she was just so frustrated, but she's like, no, never.
It's brutal.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
think I think that's why in the midst and reading the Psalms and where people are, there's almost that constant encouragement that you have to do that you don't have to break. You can hold the line, you can keep going. But there's just such a variety of issues because mine again was more of people issues versus I have friends of mine and it just seems like one thing after another. They've broken a leg. Now there's this sickness. Now there's this surgery. Now and it's just they're like, how much more can we carry on?
Well, and I think the more time we spend in the scripture, the more we realize that this walk, the way that, the walk of the Christian life is not about comfort or pleasures in life. That there will, I mean, it's promised that there will be suffering, long suffering, that we will have to persevere. Um, and I think people miss that. I think people are like, oh, just pray about it. Well, oh, just pray about it. Um, is usually pretty dismissive the way it's said, but yeah, prayer should absolutely be a part of it. So, how much time did you spend in prayer to make it through that time? I know
Well,
what you were telling me how you prayed, but
right.
how much time did you have to spend in prayer to persevere through that?
So it was really nice. I did have a little. It was literally they call it a prayer closet. It was maybe like a 5 by 8, 5 by 10 little room with a window, and I'd even just put a beanbag down in the corner and kind of filled up that whole corner. And I just remember going in there so many times, and that's what I would do. So I didn't even know the number, but I kept finding myself just compelled to go there,
Hmm.
and like I just didn't know what to do, and that's why we have to spend that time in prayer. There wasn't really anything to do except continue to do my job the way I was called to do it,
That
and
was a lot of dues, but yeah,
to endure. Like there's what do I do about these things? There's only so many things that could be, but again, it wasn't. There's no silver bullet. There was nothing that oh, if I just change this one thing. And I'm also like when it comes to ministry, I'm also not foolish enough to think, oh, if I just change positions, if I just go to another church, it'll be fine. I was smart enough not to do that. I mean, I was looking at that time. It was. I
I
think
do
so.
remember.
I think from a side, and maybe some people need to hear this, particularly as it comes to their work. I mean, I have a whole file of all the churches I would send like resumes to, and all like trying to find like, Lord, where would you move me to next? Where
Please
could
get
we?
me out of here.
Yeah, and so many of them wouldn't have anything to do with me. Or what was also super frustrating is you get called in, you're like one of two. They almost do like the wine and grape, or I guess grape juice and dine you with Baptists. No wine and dine. But you go through that, and then it would just fall apart. And
Right.
so many of those would happen, and I would get frustrated. I was like, this was awesome. I mean, Stacy would be like looking at like the real estate in the area. She was just getting all excited, and I would step back and I would realize if God had let me go into this place, I would be in a worse position than I am now,
Right.
and those things would often come out later. So it was again this game of patience. Lord, what would you have me do? And when it was time to finally step away, he made it really clear. But I was waiting for that, and so
So
I'll
instead of pushing the issue and
instead of
just
me
making the
pushing,
decisions,
and I do want to say, because I didn't say it from there, but from the pulpit, but and you mentioned holding the, I don't know exactly what you said, holding the line or whatever. I will say that there was one moment in those 3 years I caved where it was right after my father-in-law passed away, and we were leaving my mother-in-law's house, and I basically said, "Look, you're home alone. I'm like, if you let us stay, I'll send for our stuff. We won't even go back. Like, you can
right.
have your grandkids." And there were things I didn't know that were brewing that would make that impossible. And so she told me, she's like, "Here's where we are." I was like, "Okay, never mind." So that was my one. Like, I always look back, like on those 3.5 years, what do I regret most? I regret that
Mm,
more than anything else. That was my moment of weakness. I don't regret in the sense what the things that people did and the way people played the fool. That's not my fault. I didn't do anything to make them do that. That was kind of their choices. I regret I had to go through it, but that was never my responsibility.
yeah, I mean, if you didn't
I
go through it, you
responded.
wouldn't get to tell
Right.
me all the stories.
But true. But my weakness, that one weakness in the middle, most people looking at that, no one would fault me. No one
Right.
like I would have done a lot more than that. I would have resigned, walked away, all that. But I was trying to remain faithful, and that's the one place I feel I was unfaithful. And like I said, I'll that is my biggest regret out of
Right.
the whole thing. And that's kind of what, in many ways, this sermon was just a call to people that in the midst of that to remain faithful, to continue looking to God. That when you look back, like in the case of the psalmist, when they're able to look back and they see what God has done, and they've seen the rebuilding, like in this case with them, the rebuilding of the temple, the
Right.
restoration, the excitement that should follow from that, to be able to do that without the taint of how they have, almost like what Job did. Job, he didn't sin, he didn't curse God, but some of the things he said were pretty close to
He was.
blasphemous.
He
Like
was.
he,
He was hurting.
yeah, and so much so that God even rebuked him for it. Like Job was like, "My bad," you know.
Yeah, I mean, and God brought him through it
hmm
and blessed him on the other side.
He did.
But that's not promised, and I think that's kind of one of the things you keyed in on is that it's not promised, but it happens so often, right? So you made it through, and I mean, you're in a pretty incredible place in your life. I think so. I think you've been through it, and God is blessing you now on the other side of it.
I'll end it with this because, and again, I wish I had brought it up. We need to let people know about this. One of the things, if you go, and I'm gonna need some help hanging a picture in my office actually at the Bible college because I got no space in my home to do this. I had a picture commissioned from one of the parents of my former churches. And in that picture, I gave him, I said, I want it to be a collage, and it's a picture of the Memphis Bridge, which is very distinct. And it's a picture of the first building from SES that I was the first class into the first actual building. And it's a picture of that church that I was a part of. And when I did this, he was like, okay, I'm confused.
Defining
I get
moments in
two
your
of them.
life.
You know,
Yeah.
why that there is like, this is what led me. These are defining moments. And
Mm.
had I not gone through what I did with that church, it would never have brought me into the ministry opportunities I have, nor would I have the understanding that even when I went to the Philippines and I spoke to pastors and was able to share from a hurting pastor's side, it was 50 men in this room. Some of them were 20 years my senior, and to watch them, I mean, they have tears in their eyes because they know I know.
Hmm.
I was like, that's one of the reasons God took me through these things because I would never have known it. You can't know those things in theory. You have to, in
Yeah.
many ways, experience them.
Praising him in the good and praising him in the bad.
And so I want that picture hung up on my wall in my office
I got you.
because that is those things. I look at that. I can look at that picture, and I don't have animosity. I recognize what God was preparing me for.
Mm.
And that's the glory on the other side. That's what we can all hope for, is what it is that he's prepared us for,
Right.
whatever that might look like.
Well, Thomas, thanks for the conversation and the sermon. And Cape Fear, we will see you next week.